Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS Y&R Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Billy Abbott stood firm in the stark, sterile light of the Newman medical installation, his hands pulsing as he held the crumpled envelope containing the DNA test results that would ever alter the course of his life. The paper felt incredibly heavy, nearly as if the verity it carried had weight in the macrocosm itself, and yet, he'd no way been further certain of what it might say. The moment he'd stressed, anticipated, and tried desperately to avoid had arrived, and there was no turning back. Memory swamped his mind with grim force, his nonage, the quiet moments with Jack Abbott that had always felt so steady and dependable, the times he'd leaned on his family for guidance, the whispers of secrets no way spoken, and the pressure that had long coddled beneath the polished face of the Abbott and Newman family dynamics. His heart pounded so violently that he allowed it might burst through his casket, each beat echoing like the tolling of a bell marking the end of innocence. He flashed back the innumerous nights he'd lain awake, scuffling with questions that no way had clear answers, the apprehension that had always dallied around his identity, and the subtle hints that commodity had been out, though he could no way put his cutlet on it. And now, with a single regard at the test, those questions exploded into reality, the inheritable evidence that Victor Newman, the man he'd both respected and stressed in equal measure, the Goliath of Genoa City whose very name commanded respect and alarm, was not simply an important businessman, not simply a figure brewing over the megacity with his iron-fisted control, but his father. Billy's mind reeled as the disclosure crashed into him with the force of a tempest, and he sank to the edge of the satiny leather president in the office, clinging the results to his casket as if by sheer will he could keep the world from spinning entirely out of control. He could feel the weight of heritage pressing down on him, the complicated shade of love, contest, and treason that had always defined the Newman and Abbott families now belting around him like a vice. And yet, amid the shock, there was a strange, nearly unsupportable clarity, a connection, a sense of blood and bond that transcended every feud, every grudge, every argument that had ever separated their families. He allowed of Victor's unyielding intensity, the cold strategic mind that had erected conglomerates and crushed rivals, the moments when Victor's aspect had held him in equal measure of scrutiny and curiosity, and suddenly, it all made a kind of intimidating sense. Billy flashed back the nonage visits, the times he'd glinted Victor in the murk of commercial boardrooms, the way the aged man had always sounded to no further than he let on, and now the pieces fit together in a way that was both stirring and horrifying. He wept not still, not just for himself, but for the complications of love and family, for the involved web of prospects and liabilities that had suddenly fallen exactly on his shoulders. The gashes streamed down his face as he recalled every moment of his life that now carried a new weight of meaning, every achievement pigmented with mistrustfulness, every misstep amplified by the knowledge that the man who had shaped so much of Genoa City's fortune was, in verity, his father. His phone buzzed, and he realized people were formally reaching out, whispers spreading through the megacity briskly than campfire, musketeers, foes, and everyone in between, each eager to substantiation, comment, and manipulate the fallout of this disclosure. Yet, in that moment, Billy felt a nearly surreal insulation, as if the entire world had gone silent except for the pounding of his heart and the flood tide of feelings hanging to sweep him down. He allowed of Victoria, who had always been more like a family, of Abby, of the tenuous alliances and Gemütlichkeit that had formed through times of participated history, and he wondered how they would reply to the verity, how it would change the way they saw him, and more terrifyingly, how it would change the way he saw himself. The enormity of what this meant hit him in layers: the immediate emotional shock, the questions of fidelity, the whispers of treason and secretiveness that had long been buried, and the implied pledge that nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same again. Billy's studies turned to the unborn, the boardroom battles, the ineluctable competitions, the long murk of Victor's heritage that would now intertwine with his own, and he realized that life had shifted irreversibly. His father, the man whose presence could dominate an entire room without speaking, whose opinions had stumbled conglomerates and reshaped lives, was now no longer just a distant figure of authority and intimidation. He was privately connected to him, bound by blood, by the necessary trueness of family. The idea brought both comfort and terror: comfort in the knowledge that there was a piece of Victor in him, a connection to power and influence he'd no way completely grasped, and terror in the consummation that with this bond came prospects, scrutiny, and a responsibility that could crush him if he faltered. And yet, amidst the inviting swell of fear and confusion, there was also a spark of determination, a flicker of defiance that had always defined Billy Abbott. He'd face this new reality head-on, defy the trueness, scuffle with the involved commitment of the Abbott and Newman clans, and sculpt out his own identity indeed as the shadow of Victor impended large. The gashes continued to fall, but now there was a strange adaptability in them, a recognition that life had thrown him into uncharted waters and that survival would bear every ounce of wit, courage, and heart he held. And as he rose shakily to his bases, clinging the DNA results as both an amulet and a memorial of the storm he'd to ride, Billy knew that nothing in Genoa City would ever be ordinary again. Every discussion, every deal, every regard across a boardroom table, every rumored word in a hallway would carry the weight of this disclosure, and that the cotillion of power, love, treason, and family that had defined his life was about to come indeed more unfaithful, more violent, and more heartbreakingly mortal than ever ahead. The megacity outside the office windows sounded unconscious, its bustling thoroughfares ignorant of the seismic shift taking place in one man's heart, but Billy felt it acutely in every fiber of his being. He was no longer just Billy Abbott, son of Jack and Nicky, inheritor of a fabled family with its own heritage of drama, triumph, and heartache. He was the son of Victor Newman, heir at law to a complex conglomerate, and deliverer of a verity that would ripple through every corner of Genoa City. The weight of history, the pull of family, and the implacable scrutiny of society coalesced in a single, inviting reality, and Billy felt a storm of feelings, rage, grief, admiration, fear, and a conditional stopgap, crashing over him. He allowed. Of all the moments that now had new meaning, all the retired connections, the rumored exchanges he'd long ignored, the ganders from Victor that had sounded loaded with implied significance, and he realized that this disclosure wasn't just a plot twist in the cleaner pieces of his life, it was a seismic realignment of every relationship, every choice, every love and treason he'd ever endured. Billy wept for the innocence lost, for the certainty that had been shattered, and for the uncertain path ahead. But within those gashes lay also a fierce spark of resoluteness, the imperturbable determination that he'd navigate this maze of power, family, and love with every ounce of courage he held, no matter the consequences, no matter the heartache, and no matter the battles yet to come. And in that moment of pulsing vulnerability, raw emotion, and fragile clarity, Billy Abbott understood more deeply than ever that in Genoa City, secrets could destroy or define a life, and that this disclosure, the verity of his father, Victor Newman, was both the topmost challenge and the most profound gift he'd ever entered, shaping the coming chapter of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine but would face with unyielding courage, heart, and the insuperable spirit that had always defined him as a Newman by blood and an Abbott by heart. The shock of discovering Victor Newman was his father resounded through Billy Abbott's body like an electric current that refused to dissipate, leaving him shaky, drained, and yet ever hyperactive, apprehensive of every small detail around him. The sterile office smelled noiselessly of antiseptic and polished wood, but to Billy, it carried the weight of fortune, as though the veritably heir of Newman Enterprises had conspired to crush and review him all at formally. Outdoors, the megacity whistled with its usual chaos, unconscious to the seismic bouleversement in the life of one of its most prominent families, yet Billy could feel it pressing against him, the bow-wow of auto cornucopias and distant chatter serving only to amplify his insulation. He allowed. Of the innumerous times he'd spent chasing confirmation from Jack, from Nicky, from anyone who could fill the void left by a father's absence, and realized with an astounding clarity that the man he'd respected, stressed, and sometimes despised, Victor, had been quietly shaping his life in ways he'd no way purposely honored. Every decision he'd made, every moment of ambition and misstep, now carried a subcast of meaning he couldn't ignore. As he sank deeper into the plush leather president, the weight of the disclosure pressed down like a physical force, leaving him heaving, pulsing, and yet unfit to pull his studies down from the web of counter-accusations. He allowed. About Victoria, who had always been further of a family than a kinsman, and how this would change the way she perceived him, the way she'd now check his every word and action in the environment of this newfound lineage. And Abby, sweet, determined Abby, who had come his anchor through the chaos of his romantic and domestic life. What would she suppose? Would this disclosure elevate him in her eyes, or would it inseminate fear, knowing he now bore the weight of Victor's name, influence, and heritage? He knew that secrets in Genoa City infrequently remained buried, and the study of whispers circulating through the halls of Newman Enterprises and Chancellor Diligence made his stomach churn. Musketeers would come with congratulations disguised as curiosity, foes would see occasion, and family members would respond in ways both predictable and shocking, each response layering another position of complexity onto an formally inviting situation. He imagined the discussion he'd ultimately have with Victor himself, the battle of raw trueness, the acknowledgement of missed times, the reckoning with miscalculations and backstabbings, but the veritably idea of facing the man who had dominated so numerous lives filled him with equal corridor dread and craving. Billy's mind traced the history of Victor Newman, the business conglomerates erected and destroyed, the connections manipulated, the commitment tested, the power applied with iron perfection, and suddenly, the enormity of what it meant to partake blood with such a figure struck him with clarity that framed on fear. He understood that his life, which had felt at times messy, chaotic, and uncertain, was now irrevocably tied to a heritage of influence, peril, and anticipation. And yet, amid the tremblers of fear, there was also a flicker of exhilaration. He now had access to a world he'd only glinted from the edges, a chance to assert himself, to sculpt out a part in the complex ministry of power that was Newman Enterprises. He could feel the dormant ambition within him stirring, the kind of fire that had always driven him to succeed despite obstacles, to fight for respect, and to cover those he loved. But alongside ambition came the crushing weight of responsibility. With Victor as his father, there would be scrutiny he'd no way endured before, alliances to navigate, adversaries to anticipate, and family dynamics that were both intricate and unfaithful. He imagined the response of Jack Abbott, who had always been both tutor and adversary, and felt a stitch of guilt at the study of how this disclosure might wound or provoke him. The Abbott heritage was steeped in pride, adaptability, and fierce protectiveness, and Billy realized that his identity was now caught in a delicate, high-stakes balance between two of Genoa City's most important families. As his studies entwined, Billy considered the media counter-accusations. Genoa City's tabloids and gossip manufactories thrived on exposures like this, and he knew it was only a matter of time before captions would scream the verity, painting him as either an inheritor of power or a pawn in a game he could slightly understand. Yet indeed, amidst the fear of exposure, Billy felt a strange, resting connection to Victor, an inherited adaptability, a sense of strategic thinking, and a spontaneous drive to cover his own. He could nearly feel the echoes of Victor's influence coursing through him, manifesting in a heightened mindfulness of the stakes, a sharper focus on implicit pitfalls, and a deeper understanding of mortal provocations, both benign and vicious. Memories of once relations with Victor swamped back, boardroom competitions, subtle ganders that sounded to measure him, moments of uncomfortable praise, and indeed rare flashes of genuine care, each now taking on new, layered significance. Billy began to anticipate the chain responses this disclosure would spark: pressures with other Newman family members, recalibrated alliances with business associates, strained romantic dynamics, and a jacked sense of particular responsibility. Indeed, mundane opinions now carried extraordinary weight, as he realized that every choice could ripple across the complex, simple world of Newman and Abbott families. And in this curve of expectation and dread, Billy's studies returned to the most particular, most intimate aspect of this disclosure: the father-son relationship that had no way been. The missed birthdays, the absences, the implied exchanges, and the long shadow of a man who had shaped a conglomerate without ever admitting his son. These losses pressed down on Billy with a palpable heaviness. He wept again, this time with an admixture of grief, craving, and a strange sense of emancipation, as though the recognition of his father's identity contemporaneously exposed injuries and offered a path toward mending. And yet, Billy knew that the path forward would not be simple. Victor Newman wasn't a man to be fluently understood, swayed, or approached without caution. Their eventual battle would be a collision of pride, history, and emotion, and Billy felt both unrehearsed and artificially drawn to it, apprehensive that it was a defining moment that could shape his future in ways both thrilling and intimidating. Indeed, as he sat alone in the office, the echoes of once exchanges, the weight of implied trueness, and the graveness of new possibilities swirled around him, leaving him suspended in a space that was both terrifyingly uncertain and electric with eventuality. His studies stretched to the family he loved and the liabilities he now shouldered: Victoria, Abby, Jack, Nikki, and indeed the more distant cousins whose responses could vary from support to manipulation, and he knew that each commerce would now carry the implied pressure of this disclosure. Every smile, every handshake, every strategic discussion was now invested with a new subcast of meaning, and Billy honored that Genoa City would no way again be a neutral stage on which he moved without consequence. He was a Newman by blood, an Abbott by experience, and a man now acutely apprehensive of the binary patrimony shaping him, a living ground between two important, frequently opposing forces in the megacity's social, business, and emotional geography. And as he rose from the president, hands still pulsing, eyes still wet, he felt an admixture of fear, expectation, and determination, the kind of emotion that only true shock and disclosure could evoke. He knew that life would no way again be simple, that love, contest, fidelity, and treason would collide in decreasingly complex ways, and that the only certainty he could hold on to was the adaptability and imagination that had always defined him. The DNA results were further than a document. They were a key to a world he'd no way completely entered, a chart of connections, power structures, and particular identity that demanded both courage and wisdom. And in that inviting moment, Billy Abbott understood that he was standing on the threshold of metamorphosis, a cliff from which his life, his family, and his very sense of tone would be reshaped in profound, unrecoverable ways. The megacity outside continued its indifferent meter, yet Billy felt the magnitude of the disclosure with every fiber of his being, acutely apprehensive that every choice, every alliance, every gesture would now be colored by the verity of who he was, who his father was, and the involved heritage they would navigate together. And so, with a deep, jouncing breath, Billy stepped forward into the uncertain, high-stakes world that awaited him, carrying both the crushing weight and exhilarating possibility of being the son of Victor Newman, knowing that Genoa City, with all its ambition, dishonesty, love, and heartache, would no way again be the same, and that neither would he. Billy Abbott's mind continued to whirl in grim circles as the shock of Victor Newman being his father sank deeper into his knowledge, each study twisting into another, tangled with layers of emotion, remorse, fear, and a conservative, expiring sense of occasion. He'd allowed. He understood who he was, who his family was, and how the delicate balances of fidelity, love, and contest operated in Genoa City, but in a moment, all of it had been destabilized, leaving him adrift on a turbulent ocean of query and disclosure. Every memory from his nonage took on a new, nearly painful clarity, the way Victor had observed him from across boardroom tables with inscrutable expression, the rare moments of acknowledgement that had sounded arbitrary at the time, now heavy with significance, the way Victor's presence had always dominated apartments, exchanges, and opinions, shaping issues without uttering a word, impacting his life in unnoticeable ways, the faintest prints of guidance, caution, and indeed pride, frequently masked by exactingness or strategic computation, now remake in the harsh light of the DNA disclosure. And also there were the people closest to him, whose responses he both stressed and endured to anticipate, each a complex equation of emotion, fidelity, and tone interest. Victoria, his kinsman, confidant, and occasional rival, had always been a criterion of moral clarity for him, and yet he could imagine her eyes narrowing with that sharp combination of curiosity, judgment, and defensive instinct that had defined so numerous of their relations. Would she embrace this new reality, or would it color her perception of him with apprehension? The knowledge that he was now irrevocably tied to the man she had spent a continuance navigating power with, yet frequently warily, and Abby, the anchor of his heart, whose love had grown through trust, participated history, and the quiet adaptability of enduring cooperation. Would she see him else now? Would the DNA disclosure cast a shadow over their bond, coloring every tender moment, every laugh, every argument with the graveness of his birth and Victor's heritage? Billy felt a stitch of fear at the study that the people he loved most might now see him through the lens of anticipation and lineage rather than who he truly was, and yet, there was also a flicker of stopgap, a fragile belief that love might repel the weight of history, power, and secrets. Jack Abbott, his father figure in all but blood, impended large in Billy's studies, the pressure between admiration, fidelity, and the eventuality for contests surfacing in every imagined cosmos. Jack had always been the gemstone of the Abbott family, the guiding force, and yet the disclosure that Victor Newman was Billy's natural father introduced an implicit fault line between the men, one that could enkindle old grievances, business controversies, and the ever-present clash of domestic pride. Billy could anticipate the exchanges to come, the subtle ganders, the pointed questions,